do something! Was the roadmap so barren that there was nothing else to talk about? Ah. Ow. This is the Durian, a humble piece of fruit known for two things, tasting like ice cream and being one of the smelliest fruits on the planet. Hitman 3 adds a third point, however, for adding power creep to the emetic meta of the game. Since Hitman 2, the developers have been adding emetic-based weaponry into the game. The Cycle 1, the remote emetic gas device, the emetic gas grenade, the emetic gas vial. Yes, I know that's not what it's called, but it'll be more confusing if I don't call it that. And now we have the Durian. You can tell from the stats on the screen that each downside just gets removed with each iteration, to the point that all you're left with is no downsides and all upsides. This is what we call power creep, an item that supersedes what came before it because the new item that is meant to exist alongside everything else is better, and not just in some minor way for nuanced picks, but in every way. The trouble all started when the emetic gas vial released in October 2022 as a mastery reward for Ambrose Island. Holding it is not illegal, but throwing it still is. Fine, that still seems reasonable, everyone said at the time. There's still a penalty for the player. However, when the Durian was made an unlockable, this penalty was removed. The one downside it has now, which I struggle to call a downside, is a hidden stat where 47 takes damage if he's within the gas cloud. This is what we call a dump stat, a stat on an item or character that is not beneficial to the player, nor is it an appropriate downside for it, or them. The whole point of these items is to throw it away from you, so 47 taking damage from emetic weaponry is, basically superfluous. And even if you're caught in the gas cloud, it doesn't do enough damage to kill you.
Antitoxin administered.
In fact, this hidden damage over time stat is remarkably similar to the very same hidden stat from sedative items, like the gold brick and the blue Easter egg, which I'm sure the more astute Hitman players will have noticed. It gives a reason for why the gas cloud for the Durian is inexplicably blue instead of green. My theory for how this even happened is honestly fairly simple. I flip-flopped on the Durian's effects during development. First, they decided to go in with the decision to make the Durian an emetic, but at some point they instead decided it could be better for it to be a sedative instead. So they added some extra code with hurt parameters on top of the originally designed for emetic items code the Durian was otherwise using, and then, for whatever reason, decided to revert their new decision and make it go back to emetics, but did not change anything else about it, other than the payload. So, a little bit of myth busting for you. Emetics simply don't damage the player via gas clouds. The only exception to this is when they're aerosolized, such as when you poison Nola Cassidy's HVAC or the underground server farm on Haven Island, but that actually applies to all poisons, just not to the emetic items you can carry around. The Durian being unlockable now means you can take it anywhere, outside of its original context, and throw it in a public area without anyone being suspicious, other than your poor victim being confused for a hot moment. Nobody cares that you made them sick, oftentimes blaming something else despite you, the player, literally standing in front of them.
I just knew that cheap-ass sandwich would come back to haunt me.
It's not a good item to have around, let's be fair here. I smell a storm coming. Surprisingly, when I was doing research for this video, I was expecting some pushback on this from people who claim that single-player games don't need balance patches or that you don't have to use it to have fun, in a clearly selfish attempt at convincing others that unbalanced items are okay as long as they're fun. But yeah, from everything I've seen online, most people seem to agree that the Durian needs nerfing, and more importantly, emetics as a whole need changing. To be honest, I have no idea how emetics can be changed. Maybe make it so all the items with emetic properties are illegal to carry around, sans context. The Durian and gas vial being legal to carry in Ambrose at least makes sense to me, but the player throwing it and that being legal anywhere else shouldn't have happened. This also applies to the sedative egg from the Season of Undying, don't at me.
What just happened?
When it comes to video games, blueprints and expectations are set by the developers as to how they should balance their game. Literally in the case of Unreal 4, as that's part of the visual coding language is literally called blueprints. Anyway, a single player solo stealth experience is not going to have the same design philosophy or gameplay flow as a dungeon punk hero shooter, which itself won't be the same as a historical alternate universe PvE co-op shooter. There are balance considerations and player concessions developers have to watch out for. If something is overtuned, and the Durian clearly is, then it needs changing to be more in line with what has come before it. Or, to put it another way, cheesy items don't tend to be that rewarding for the player in the long run, even if players like them now. Better to nip it in the bud while you can, before it becomes even more problematic. The often repeated argument I also tend to hear is that games are designed with pro players and speedrunners in mind and not around casual players, which is a bit of a misunderstanding and conflation of several facts. Yes, in general, speedrunners and pro players are kept in mind when balance changes occur. It's not uncommon for developers to even actively seek these people out. But the parts that players who parrot this conveniently don't mention that the most effective people to listen to are those who know your game franchise inside out. And even then, in my experience, this is on a case-by-case basis, and casual players are plenty guilty of complaining about when things are unbalanced as well, and they are also listened to. This is why games of all stripes, single player or multiplayer, it's not specific to either genre despite the belief, tend to ignore casual players. In actuality, games are designed with several groups in mind. Metagroups, if you want the fancy term for it. These are casual, experienced, professional, and speedrunners. Casual players who are learning the game and just messing about, not really caring about the game's deeper mechanics just yet. Experienced players who know the game's general mechanics and know how to beat a level, but nothing more than that. Professional players who know a few tips and tricks of the trade that most don't, and are not afraid to use them, as well as understanding how the game works to a great extent. And then we have speedrunners, players who know the game engine far better than anyone, possibly even more so than the developers, and are a wealth of information for everyone else to learn off of. They know what they are doing, and they are a fearsome sight to behold, I swear. There are, of course, groups within groups, but this gets my point across much better. Otherwise, we deal with complex ideas like player fragmentation, which would make this already long video very, very boring. Best to simplify. In fairness, games like CS2 are designed around competitive play in mind. It's not even trying to be subtle about that. But I really don't think that's as common as people like to stereotype it as. Fighting games, very famously, are also competitive focused, though that's more to do with the dexterity of button inputs by players rather than OP characters by themselves. I am sure they exist. And then we have games like Mario Kart 8, an otherwise fairly casual game series, which added a super horn back in 2014, which lets you destroy the ever-annoying blue shell or anything else in the vicinity. This was widely liked by players, not only because it gave experienced players a way to avoid some of the randomness of Mario Kart, but it was quite a rare item, so it's never going to make anyone always front run. Sticking with Mario Kart as a comparison, and I swear I'm going somewhere with this, you have Bike Kart Wii, which isn't the official name for the game, but it may as well be, because bikes, no matter what weight class, are just superior to karts. And the reason for this is because bikes can pop wheelies, which give them a speed advantage compared to karts, which can do longer turbos and are meant to be faster, but are actually slower in practice. This is what happens when you don't make a game console that's not able to patch itself easily. I like Mario Kart Wii, I really do, but it is complacent as all hell, and this is something games need to avoid, and a good example of two things. One, that game patches are beneficial even if those changes are not something you like, and two, that games with metas like this tend to get very samey and complacent, and shaking up the meta is actually quite a good thing. Mario Kart Wii still plays very well, but be it time trials, single player or multiplayer, the very meta of bikes defies the very name of the game, Mario Kart Wii. In general, it's better for a lot of different options to be viable for more groups of players. A well-balanced game focuses on many sides of the equation, and it'd be very counterproductive for developers only focus on one group of players over another on every single decision. It alienates potential newcomers and generally increases the skill ceiling of the game to the point that only the highest levels of players will be interested. As games go, Hitman is not a hardcore stealth game like Sniper Elite is, and people tend to forget that. The gameplay has more concessions that are specifically aimed at lower levels of play, something Hitman 2016 basically had as an internal manifesto. Everything is more consistent than before, melee weapons are more versatile as they can KO as well as kill people, and there are more HUD elements that actually tell you important information. Hell, opportunities came about because the maps became so complex that people wouldn't know where to start in a level. No game is without balance, and anyone suggesting that single player games don't need it either don't know what they're saying or are deliberately trying to ignore something that they don't like. YouTube exists, strategy guides still exist, forums still exist. And it's not like social media like Facebook, Twitter, Discord or Reddit hasn't existed for decades either. The dissemination of tips and tricks in games in the information age, when all the help and tips you could ever need is but a click away and instantly available for the player. That means that gameplay preferences pass on from player to player. What items are good? What are the best ways of doing X, Y, and Z? What mode is the best one to grind experience points on? The prevalence of videos and chats and live streams and forum conversations make this possible. Ideas online are expanded upon to form a meta. Actually, several, again, complicated, and this is just as valid a reason for developers to change their game to quash problematic items or paths or anything else that starts with P when it comes to their game design. If they don't like the results players have come up with when playing their game, they absolutely have that right to change stuff. And gaming is not the solo endeavour players like to think it is sometimes. You get outside help, way more often than I think people would like to admit. Single player games may not have direct player versus player balancing concerns, but there is still an indirect cause and effect in all games when you're looking for tips and strategies online. Single player or not. That definitely has an effect. When it comes to game balance, there is only one constant that remains true throughout all video games. You win some, you lose some. People of all kinds, of all metagroups, like knowing what's good and what isn't. Play how you want to, I'm a very big believer in that. But there are absolutely limits on what developers will accept as fun for the player if it goes against their game design. And it has to be like this, otherwise the game in question will lose focus on what it wants to be, and may actually alienate the already existing player base along the way. Hitman doesn't have rocket launchers with explosive rounds that count as accidents, because that would pervert the design of the game as players actually want it. Right, sorry, where were we? Oh yeah, Hitman balance. Hitman WoW has actually had several item adjustments throughout the years. One of the most notable I can think of is the remote breaching charge, which went from having a capacity of 2 in 2016 to only having 1 in the following game. This was done to nerf the silent explosive trick commonly seen in contracts mode, where breaching charges were used as a way to get an explosive kill without breaking silent assassin conduct, the highest score in the game. Breaching charges are basically silent, and so long as the target could be isolated, and as mentioned, this is even easier than ever due to Emetic weaponry, it was a pretty easy kill to pull off. This, however, only nerfed it. It was not removed, as you can still do it, it just requires sacrificing gear slots to bring more of the breaching charges in, or you find other ways of fulfilling the explosive kill requirement in a contract, which in turn makes the gameplay gravitate towards Puzzle River instead of Cheese Alley. Many games rely on the risk-reward dynamic when it comes to game balance, and not just with items either. That philosophy permeates throughout map design, character design, even where to place guards and locations of opportunities. It's never just one thing about items. If the player has no risk in their actions, then the reward they get out of what they do is cheapened, and that means something is out of whack. The inverse is also true. If the risk of an action is too much, then the reward is too expensive to reach. As an example of this, the ether virus forced players to deal with it. You cannot complete the mission without going to the biolab or doing what I did when speedrunning it. It's been criticised even by developers as a flat-out flaw of the level that makes it a pain to replay. The risk of going down there is far too great, and the reward, letting you complete the damn mission, makes the level really annoying to replay and less satisfying. There's a very good reason back in 2016 one of the most popular contracts on Sapienza was World of Tomorrow minus the Ether virus. A good example of a cheesy item that got nerfed back in 2022 was the Molotov cocktail. This item was the perfect example of if you don't test the thing before releasing it, it's going to cause bedlam. For those who need reminding, ow, that hurt. Where was I? Oh, right. The Molotov was able to wallbang, it had an AoE that was dependent on how far away targets were from the source of impact, and also had so many bugs that it needed immediate attention. This item should not have been released in the state it was. The ability to wallbang sounds fine, until you realise guards tend to be near targets and have a habit of having their backs to a wall when in a private conversation. Then the AoE issue was basically save scum city central. It was essentially a complete guess as to if the Molotov would set the person on fire, which granted an accident kill, or if it exploded in their face, which would break SA conduct. It wasn't a great weapon to use. It felt random, not consistent. It's a weapon that did not give any idea on how radiuses worked, and if you were told, like in CS2 for example, then you still have to account for the movement of the target, which is hard to deal with at the best of times.
Is that? No!
Somebody fucking help me!
It all feels random despite not being random. As we live in the future, this did eventually get nerfed, so now that it's consistently an explosion that breaks SA, and it no longer wallbangs, and all the bugs have been fixed. That's a good thing. To this day, this is probably the quickest IO have ever changed an item. The changes obviously caused backlash from folks, myself included I might add, in that it's no longer unique as it's now functionally an explosive rubber duck. That's a fair complaint, but I'd still argue that something looking cool and unique does not override the game's latent design. It was catnip to players who wanted to mess around with a broken item, and I think people forget that. It was disruptive to the game's meta, just not in a healthy way that gels with either reality, throwing a Molotov at someone is not an accident in any universe, or what has come before it. I'm fine with shaking up the meta, that keeps gameplay fresh, but not like that. I'd rather IO do some changes to their already existing weapons like silver ballers, which frankly outclass all but two other pistols. The moment you compare a pistol to the silver baller, there's no contest. The latter wins each time. Headshot damage makes the most sense to me, especially given those pistols have focus mechanics that's meant to make aiming better that don't actually work. I don't know, the meta of emetics, silver ballers and sedatives just needs breaking up somehow. There's no need to ever try anything else, and it just leads to an inventory of weapons and items that have next to no uses in a run, which is an outright good thing about Freelancer, where these sorts of weapons are more useful. This type of problem is also why I agree with sentiment that the clues system in Whittington Creek needs adjusting on replays of the level. Even if IO changed it so you had to search for one clue instead of the 3 you meant to, it'd go a long way in incentivizing replays and might even be more fun. Hell, there's precedent for this. With Chung King, Olivia will hack the ICA database so you don't have to deal with it, and you wrote the story in such a way that doesn't contradict the player's actions. This is a good way of solving that issue, and I take some inspiration from that IO. If you want an example of a game that just doesn't have great balance to begin with, well, we already have one in this very franchise, Hitman Absolution. Absolution is the black sheep of the Hitman series, a truly fascinating divergence from the Hitman formula, both tonally and gameplay wise. The levels are linear, the aesthetics are gritty and dirty, with a yellow dust filter over everything. It all feels like a grindhouse revenge film, not a sneaky beaky John Woo action flick. However, for every one thing this game gets right mechanics-wise, it gets 2 things wrong. The game has auto-lock-on for melee. Cool, that's genuinely useful. It makes throwing objects at people easier. Oh yeah, that melee weapon you pick up, that's the only one you're allowed. You can't have small infinite items like you can in Blood Money. Sucks to be you. Oh, and the on-screen effects when you distract someone are f***ing distracting. You can hide 2 bodies in one container. Great, that lets me clear out a room better and I can hide inside it while the body is in there as a bonus. But it is painfully slow to do this, and the controls of dragging bodies are not inverted, much like it was in Blood Money. The animations are top-notch, and I wish IO could use the cover-to-cover roll from this game in Hitman 3. The silver baller sounds weird.
clean kill.
Point shooting is so out of place in a game like this, and the fact that the developers had to think of a contrived scenario creating new characters just to show it off really says a lot about how this game was meant to be played. Say what you will about the dongle system for chunking in H3, but at the very least that acts like a natural fetch quest while sneaking around the facility. And the less said about Instinct, the better. It's a wonder this trilogy managed to salvage it, honestly. And that was tied to the disguise system, by the way, which made it very awkward to play. Absolution, if you couldn't work it out by now, was a string of bad balance decisions that were overridden because the mechanics were cool in concept. Yes, point shooting is cool. Yes, Instinct actually does make sense given how complex the world and AI has become, and looking through walls is inherently quite fascinating. But the mechanical makeup is completely lost in the translation from paper to gameplay, and I am half convinced a lot of these mechanics were not refined in playtesting. Rule of cool should never override how a game plays, and Absolution is a perfect example of that. This is why single player and multiplayer game balance matters. This is why IO and other developers should playtest their games when they're adding new items to see how it affects the rest of their game world. The instinct mechanic in Absolution proved that if you just give people too many risks for the mechanic and not enough of a reward, then the gameplay suffers incredibly hard, and the player is just bogged down with unnecessary gameplay baggage. As a final note to end on, the Durian is what happens when the Emetic meta gets out of hand. It's what happens when developers get complacent when they adjust their game design. Instead of quashing a stale meta, the Durian actively enables it. And there's nothing worse than a game that gets boring because items get less fun to use across all skill levels. Or most of them. And with that, thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.